The Prince of Egypt is a movie by Dreamworks Animation Studios from 1998. It follows the story of Moses from his time as a child up to his time delivering the Hebrews from Egypt. It is a story that is mostly true to the original story in Exodus, but it has several changes. So we're going to go through an overview of the story, as well as go over a couple of the differences and some of the similarities that you might find between the movie and the book. And we are going to evaluate how well it performs at delivering the story to a modern audience. So with that, the movie starts out with a striking image of the Hebrew men working tirelessly to build the temples and the statues for the Egyptian pharaoh. It is accompanied by a song of terrible woe and suffering, and they're calling out for God to deliver them from their oppressors in Egypt. And after that, it moves over to a view of the town of the Hebrew. The mother of Moses sees that the Egyptians are taking the Hebrew babies and they're being dropped into the Nile River. So she goes and takes the baby and puts him in a basket, sets him adrift on the river, and then the basket comes to the wife of the pharaoh, who takes the baby, smiles, and decides to adopt him, naming him Moses and making him the brother of her current child, Ramesses. Fast forward to the ends of young adulthood for Moses and Ramesses. They're adopted brothers, and we get a glimpse at their relationship. They are best friends, and they do get at each other, but they have a great time together. Moses eggs Ramesses on to do a lot of damage to Pharaoh's work, which causes a little bit of a conflict within Ramesses because he is trying to live up to his father's expectations and one day become a great pharaoh. Everything changes for Moses when he finally meets his brother and sister, Marion and Aaron. They reveal to him that he's a Hebrew, which he had no idea of before. This is confirmed with a vision and then also seeing hieroglyphs, and that shakes him up, and he realizes that he is in fact a Hebrew. This makes it really difficult for him to continue on with his life because he sees all these Hebrews in anguish and realizes that he is one of them. And he sees one of these Hebrews getting beaten senselessly by a taskmaster, and he is moved by this and runs to try to stop him and inadvertently kills him, causing him to need to flee Egypt. Moses, after leaving Egypt, ends up getting into the lands of Midian and saving the younger daughters of Jethro, the priest there. He is rewarded for that by being an honored guest at a dinner, which he feels that he does not deserve, and Jethro teaches him the ways of God and how God looks upon him, and that makes him change his views. He comes to know his religion, and he is brought into their fold and starts a life with Zipporah, marries her. This is all interrupted when Moses one day follows a lamb outside of the area of his sheep, and he sees a burning bush, and it ends up being his God, and he is introduced to God and is tasked with going back to Egypt to make Pharaoh let his people go. He is apprehensive, but God speaks to him harshly and then gives him the power to call upon God's divine power by using his staff. So Moses decides to go, and he goes back to Egypt. Upon arriving back in Egypt, Moses is surprised to find that Ramesses is now the pharaoh. They're both really happy and excited to see each other. They embrace each other, and they're both really happy. But this can't last because Moses has to ultimately tell Ramesses what God commands, and he tells him that he needs to let his people go. Ramesses at first thinks this is a joke, but Moses does insist. When Ramesses finds that Moses is not kidding, he realizes this, and he seems sad at first, but then you see him become hardened against Moses and the Hebrews, and he doubles the workload of his people. The Hebrews are upset with Moses for causing them further pains and suffering, so they are throwing things at him and ridiculing him, and Aaron, his brother, is leading them in this. But Miriam comes to his defense and encourages him to continue on. So Moses confronts Pharaoh again, and when he refuses to let the Hebrews go, he turns the Nile River to blood, and this is the beginning of the plagues that are unleashed upon Egypt. The plagues continue with the frogs, the livestock dying, fire raining from the skies, and all manner of illnesses and terrors among the people of Egypt. But Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and this is referenced in epic song between Ramesses and Moses. Moses pleading that he let his people go, and Ramesses saying he will never let his people go. After all the plagues except one have been cast upon Egypt, Moses comes to try to reason with Ramesses because he knows that this last one is going to be really terrible for all of Egypt, but also for his brother Ramesses. So they do have a moment where they're reflecting on how nice their childhood was, but this is interrupted when Ramesses' son comes into the room and recognizes Moses as the one that's been causing all these terrors among Egypt. So Ramesses asks why this is going on. Moses says ultimately it has to happen, it's God's command, and that he must let his people go. So Ramesses becomes angry, and he says that he is going to finish the job of his father and murder more Hebrews. So Moses said, "You bring this upon yourself." And then comes the death of the firstborn in Egypt. The sky opens up and takes the souls of all the young Egyptians, and the next morning, Moses comes to see Ramesses, and Ramesses is in complete anguish and is broken over the loss of his son. So, in his brokenness, he finally relents and gives Moses and the Hebrews permission to leave Egypt. The Hebrews leave Egypt and they are rejoicing, but ultimately they come to the Red Sea and find that Ramesses has decided to follow them. So God opens up the sky and brings up a monument of fire out of the ocean, and it lands right in front of Ramesses, blocking him from coming to the Hebrews. And Moses walks into the sea and presses down his staff, and the seas part, and the Hebrews are able to walk safely to the other side. And they crash down just as the full entirety of the Egyptian army has entered, and so they are swallowed by the sea, leaving only Ramesses on the banks calling out to Moses. And that concludes the movie. The Hebrews rejoice, and then we see Moses coming down with the Ten Commandments. Now, there are a lot of major similarities between this movie and the book, which are pretty self-explanatory, especially to all of you who have been in this class with me, so I'm not going to go into much depth on that. There are countless biblical correlations because this is, in fact, a retelling of that story, but I will focus on some of these major differences. The first one will go in a somewhat chronological order. Pharaoh's wife is the one who finds Moses rather than his daughter, as it is in the Bible. This is mainly to set up a closeness between Moses and the Pharaoh that succeeds his father. The next one is that Moses was not nursed by his mother and then given to the Egyptians. He was just raised by the Egyptians from the beginning. There was no connection with Moses and his family from that point on. And that brings us to the next point. Ramesses is played by a British guy named Lord Voldemort. He is not the pharaoh that is depicted in the Bible, because that pharaoh has no mentioned name, and also historically and archaeologically, you do not see Ramesses at the time of Moses. So this is a big adjustment, the biggest adjustment in the movie, to bring a closeness to Moses by having him be his adopted brother and opening things up to have a bit of a more personal connection between Moses and the pharaoh. This one relates to the previous three. Because Moses was not raised by his mother as he was in the Bible, he had absolutely no idea that he was a Hebrew. This is an extremely unlikely scenario, if you really think about it, but this is how it's portrayed in the movie. And he has no idea that of his heritage until he finally meets Miriam and Aaron when he's a young adult. And one of the reasons this is unlikely is because he was raised among Egyptians and he was a completely different race. So it would have been obvious. He probably would have heard other people say something to him. There's any number of reasons why this would not have made any sense. But because he didn't know his mother and all that, it's just made to draw his ties to Egypt a little bit more solid for the purposes of the film. Next one, Jethro teaches Moses about the Hebrew God. This is pretty unlikely because, well, first of all, Jethro is a priest of Midian. He is not a Hebrew. He has no connection there. In the Bible, he is definitely not responsible for teaching Moses about God. But, I mean, he is brought to faith, you could say, by Moses and the actions of God within the Exodus. The next one, Moses has no children prior to going to Egypt. This is a pretty minor detail, but in the Bible, Moses does have a son, and he ends up having a second child as well. But this all happens around the time, like first of all, the first one before going to Egypt, the second one afterwards. But yeah, there's no mention to this whatsoever in the movie. Next, as you can see in the picture on the right, Moses probably would have looked more like this if the movie was accurate, because Moses was not a young man when he returned to Egypt. He was, in fact, around 80 years old. This is, just meant to bring the Moses character a little bit closer to a younger audience. And then finally, Aaron in the Bible speaks for Moses. He meets him outside of Egypt. They kiss. They are, they are comrades. They work together to liberate the Hebrews. However, in this movie, he is more of a skeptical nemesis and spends more of his time either being useless or ridiculing Moses. So a pretty stark contrast to the book. Now for the final part of this, is the Prince of Egypt effective at communicating the story of Moses? I would argue absolutely yes. It does a lot of embellishments. There are huge differences here and there, but it is overall a faithful take on the story. The main reason that I think that all the changes that they made works is some of them don't add a whole lot to the story if you're isolating it as they did in this movie. I mean, as part of the longer narrative of Exodus, yeah, it makes changes. But if you're only telling this story from Moses' birth to the crossing of the Red Sea, stuff like him having a son doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to include here. The biggest difference that they made was the closeness between Moses and the Pharaoh. Being the son of the original Pharaoh, Seti, and also being the brother of Ramesses, who plays the Pharaoh that he faces when he returns to Egypt, just adds a emotional element and a conflict element that really make people more engaged in the story, and they really get to see the conflict and the difficulty in this task for Moses to liberate his people, which is definitely present in the Bible, but not as relatably communicated, because the Bible is a little bit more brief and cold about the way that it portrays things. It's definitely poetic, but it's not as emotionally tying as the way that it's depicted in this movie. So all in all, I would say this is a great representation, and it definitely is something that I recommend anyone watch if you haven't already. that's all for today. Thank you so much for watching, and I had a good time with all you guys in this class. I hope you have a nice break and a great semester coming up in this spring.